I was just speculating that the fact that this is my third try to pull off this talk, but that it has ultimately come through, and I'll let you be the judge of whether it's satisfactory or disappointing in the end. But there's a lesson in that for dealing with the complex of issues that we're going to talk about today, having to do with Russia and the U.S.-Russia relationship. And I think it's that things tend to be long and drawn out and difficult, with high expectations up front and a fair amount of disappointment in the middle, but usually they work out okay in the end. So let's, despite thin ice and all my warnings of doom, I think in general things will probably be all right. Before I start, it's useful for me just to kind of calibrate how much background I give and of what sort, to know what kind of connections folks in this room have to Russia. So if I could just ask by show of hands, how many of you in this room have been to Russia before? Okay, great. How many of you were there at all during Soviet times? Okay, not bad. We may have some diplomats on this side of the room. And how many of you in your current professional capacities deal with the Russians? Military, civilian? Okay. All right, so some connection. How about dealing with other former Soviet republics? Okay, no, that's helpful. So actually, my mission, as it was described to me by my colleagues, was to try and convey to you not only the state and the challenges for the U.S.-Russia relationship, but also where's Russia coming from when it approaches the United States, when it approaches the post-reset era that we're in now, and when it approaches the global security challenges that animate both of our countries. And that starts with how Russia sees itself. So rather than starting right from the thin ice and the fresh observations from the field, so to speak, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of history and a little bit of background that I think can maybe dispel some mythology. So the first is the myth that Russians are passive. I think there are a lot of reasons why people tend to speculate and generalize about Russians, believing that somehow the circumstances in which Russia lives, that have formed Russia's culture, empower powerful states and weaken individual will and dissent. Something about cold weather, you can't survive without the collective, hostile neighboring tribes, major empires all around Russia's exposed land borders, vast distances, isolation from outside influences, multi-ethnicity, the fact that you could play Cossacks against Chechens, and someone was always outside the rules of the community, the church-state relationship, the traditionalism of Russian peasantry. These are all reasonable theories as to why perhaps Russians might be unusually subject to the will of powerful states and autocrats. I would posit, though, that if you look at Russian history, that's not the case at all. Some of the most dramatic moments of citizens standing up against the state, of organization and dissent, have in fact taken place in Russia. Not least, of course, the Russian Revolution. Everyone is thinking about that. Go back to the 19th century, the Decembrist uprising, which was officers who had taken part in the Napoleonic Wars and gone all the way to Paris, came back and organized an uprising, ultimately unsuccessful. Revolutions which began actually as early as the late 19th century, but most famously in 1905 and 1917. The mobilization of Russian society in World War II, which one could argue was hardly top-down. Think about the partisan movement. The watch I'm wearing right now belongs to a grandfather of mine who was a partisan in Belarus. He didn't do that because a powerful state came in and told him, take up a hunting rifle and hunt Germans in the woods. He did that because of the resourcefulness and the sort of self-motivation of the Russian citizenry. They tend to solve problems very much on their own, precisely because state and state institutions are unreliable. Of course, think about 1991. One of the big gaps in the narrative between East and West about what happened at the end of the Soviet Union is the belief we tend to harbor in the West that somehow we, Ronald Reagan, the United States, NATO, brought an end to the Soviet Union. Well, we were certainly part of the landscape in which that happened, but if you ask any Russian will tell you, we ended the Soviet Union. Now, some Russians may have intended something different. Some Soviet citizens may have intended something different. For example, when they voted for independence for the Soviet republics, they may have intended to end the political system without ending some of the benefits that they enjoyed from the Soviet system. But fundamentally, they believed the authorship of that demise was their own. Now, what is leadership in Russia? Well, the Tsardom, if you can think of it in those terms, and Putin is very much thought of as a Tsar today. He's described that way, frankly, quite openly in the Russian press, had traditionally, after Peter the Great, been a mixture of at least three things. First, of course, the traditional divine right, which in the context of Orthodox Christianity was as strong as in any Western European monarchy, if not stronger. Second, a kind of clan-based oligarchy. We see that in Russia to this day, whether it was boyars who forged deals, came together under Peter, were controlled by Peter, and their legitimacy came from service to Peter, or it's today's financial oligarchs, people who've made lots of money, they cut deals with one another, they do what's called elite pacting, basically, they'll compete with each other to an extent, but they'll all agree upon a basic set of rules that protects their stuff. And then thirdly, and this is the part that we often forget about, is a fair dose of what I'd call European, Greco-Roman rational bureaucracy. Peter certainly introduced that with his table of ranks and many of his other rationalizations of the system. But these things persist to this day, and actually one of the, I think, more telling observations, it's one of those extreme examples. My rhetoric coach has always said you should never make Nazi comparisons or Hitler comparisons, but I'm going to do it because Tim Snyder, a great scholar of Eastern Europe, said that actually if you compare infamously meticulous Nazi record keeping to Soviet record keeping, the Soviets were much, much more thorough. So you can see throughout Russian history the sort of rational bureaucracy that we think we sort of invented in the West actually was quite dominant. And of course Russia has a number of other unique ideologies that inform its vision of what it is. Very prominently the idea of Russia having a unique destiny in the world, a unique role of leadership, of empire, the concept that Russia was the third Rome. There was the first Rome, there was the Holy Roman Empire, and then there was Russia as the third Rome, which again persists to this day. It is the world's largest country. At its height, the Russian imperial holdings stretched from East Prussia to Mendocino County, California, or what is today Mendocino County, California. This is an enormous, enormous empire. It's essentially half the world. It is truly multi-ethnic, truly multi-confessional, even to this day, and uniquely a non-metropolitan empire. And what I mean by that is it's an empire in which citizens, I'm not talking about serfs, I'm not talking about, prisoners captured in wars or suppressed minor ethnic groups, but citizens share more or less the same rights wherever they are. You don't have to be living in Moscow, although it is the center of the universe, or St. Petersburg before it, to be considered a citizen of the Russian Empire, a unique feature. Is Russia Asian or European in Russia's own worldview? Well, this is a long-standing debate, and it's not resolved. There's been a debate for literally centuries over the Slavophile ideology versus the Westernizer ideology. One of the things that I noticed very early in reading the literature from this debate, of course, is that both the Slavophile camp, this is the camp that basically rejects Western rationalism, rejects the bureaucracy that I described, rejects Petrine reforms in general, they use what we would call Western Greco-Roman rational logic to make their arguments. So there's kind of irony that this stuff is so deeply ingrained in Russians, their Europeanness, it's not a choice, it's not a descriptor, it simply is. And yet at the same time, there are all of these kind of memes that recur throughout Russian history. For example, St. Petersburg as a window onto Europe. This implies that Europe isn't behind the window of St. Petersburg. It isn't within Russia. Europe is something foreign. Europe is something far away. Easternness, differentness, Slavicness is often used as an excuse for non-feasance. Very often one will encounter a certain point in a conversation with Russians where it begins with a desire to be more and more and more and more a part of the Western community, but then when you find out how hard that is and how disappointing Russia's performance thus far has been, Russians say, well, fundamentally you realize we're something different. We may look like you, but actually we're Asian. So I think this is a concept that's very much in flux. It's a kind of constantly open question. And I think it makes it hard for Russians today that Asianness, the concept of Asianness, is changing so dramatically itself. And many of you may deal with different parts of Asia, South Asia, East Asia. But if you think about, for example, how we in the United States thought about, Asian economies or Asian technology or Asian societies just 20 or 30 years ago versus how we think of them today as potential world leaders or world beaters. The same changes have occurred in Russia. At the same time, though, that people who had previously been let's say, relatively equal Soviet citizens, people from Central Asia, for example, are today seen as the absolute lowest caste or rung in society in Moscow. They're literally the people who sweep the streets. They're illegal. They get rounded up. Chinese merchants get rounded up and booted out of the country. So there's a lot of kind of pejorative that accompanies the concept of Asianness, at the same time that Europeanness can be very problematic for Russians, as deeply embedded as it is in Russian culture. There's a further contradiction when Russia looks at the outside world that's inherent in the Soviet legacy. And that is that, of course, there was a tremendous amount of evangelism in the notion of world communism, right? The Russian Revolution began from the premise that we're going first, but the rest of the world is going to follow very quickly. And so inherently, Russian domestic policy, foreign policy, social policy, economic policy, everything was interwoven with the idea that there would sooner or later be a world proletarian revolution. And yet, Stalin rather quickly decided that socialism in one country, as he called it, was the only realistic approach to managing Russian affairs. And of course, as we know, Russia's foreign policy establishment today and the Soviet foreign policy establishment before them were famously cynical and realist. These are probably among the most cynical foreign policy thinkers in the world. So how does today's Putin and Putin's circle elite think about the world? Is it to what degree is it informed by these kind of broad civilizational phenomena, and to what degree is it simply kind of naked self-interest, what you would expect from a group of kind of robber barons? I tend to think of it in the following terms. The Putin team was shaped by the experience of their own recent past. They see the world as being complex, basically dangerous, highly unpredictable. Their worldview is informed heavily by the collapse of the Soviet Union, by the loss of many of the things that they had taken to be predictable in their personal lives. And again, I'm not saying that everything that came before was good for these people and everything that has come now is bad. Patently, that's not the case, because of course you had people who were quite poor in the Soviet system, who were struggling and striving and not getting very far, and who today are the oligarchs and the dominant leaders. In fact, some of those people would have been criminals even in the Soviet system, and yet today they are the ruling class. So it's not that before was good and today is bad, it's that before was predictable, before was comfortable, and today is not. And I think that that worldview kind of infects their broader perspective on international challenges and foreign policy. Of course, dependency on energy and commodity prices tends to narrow the thinking of the Russian leadership to the question of market uncertainty, right? What's the price going to be tomorrow? What are the likely events that are going to change that price? Because, of course, the edifice of the state depends very heavily on that. And that makes it, while increasingly central in Russian life under Putin, increasingly brittle and unstable as well. So thus this sort of notion that the world is an unstable place. And this is the number one thing I think that you'll encounter when you're talking to senior Russian thinkers, is this belief that the world is not a place which is dictated by some kind of historical march toward freedom and democracy, or some kind of, Fukuyama evolution towards the end of history, but rather that the world is simply a complex and dangerous place where the things that you thought you knew are probably not true. And in their lives, that has certainly been the case. There is further the belief that in this complex world, multipolarity is the rule of the day, that Russia certainly is among a small set of leading global powers, but that it needs to work with others in order to carry the day. And that, by the way, vice versa is true for the United States, it's true for China, it's true for any other leading power. This is the Russian view. I'm not commenting on the recent national intelligence estimate. Well, I will. I think it's pretty good. Or about what America's worldviews ought to be, but simply the idea that the Russians see this as an absolutely immutable reality, that you've got to be at the top table, but you've also got to be willing to work with others who are at that table. Now, typically, and this is very much in line with the kind of European versus Asian psychology that I described, working with the West is Russia's first choice. If they can work with the United States, if they can work with Europe, they'd rather do that. But it's never going to come at the cost of sacrificing what Russia considers to be its independent foreign policy course. Now, that's a flexible concept, right? Whether the case is Syria or Libya or Iran, they can pick a different thing to attach this sort of moniker of independence to. But I think fundamentally what they're saying is, if we have defined Russian interests in a particular way, whether because of the personal interest of the Russian leadership or genuine national interest, we are not prepared to make a sacrifice solely for the sake of cooperation. And indeed, we will find other partners when we need to. And this is, of course, where China tends to come into the picture, in particular the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, although recognizing that that kind of cooperation also has limits, right? China refused to recognize the result of Russia's war with Georgia in 2008 and its recognition of the separatist territories. Indeed, even in the Russian-dominated CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is all former Soviet republics, even the Belarusians did not, who are Russia's sort of closest allies in that system, and entirely dependent on Moscow, frankly, for their economic survival, even they did not recognize the outcome of Russia's war. So Russia can often find itself, despite this philosophy that seeks to have cooperation and dialogue, it can often find itself quite isolated. Now, Russians rationalize this, and have in particular recently, in a number of ways. The first is that they'd like to see themselves as the sole rational actor in a system gone mad. In that respect, Russians appreciate getting to be the middleman, the broker, the trusted key player. This is where they thought the situation in Syria was going. Unfortunately, I think for everyone, it hasn't headed in that direction. But ideally, for example, the Russians tried to pull this off in Libya, where they sent Mikhail Margelov, a member of the Senate and the President's representative for Africa, to try to negotiate a nonviolent outcome. Russia likes to believe that it is in a position where it can be trusted and listened to by all the actors, when others are influenced by what it considers to be mere politics or hypocrisy. And the examples, prominent examples, being the United States on the issue of human rights, right? Consistently seen as being hypocritical by Russia on human rights. Myriad examples from China to Mexico to Saudi Arabia of where we treat Russia differently than those countries, or indeed where we treat many other countries with an unfair standard. Certainly, seeing hypocrisy in the West's approach towards Iran's nuclear program versus Pakistan's nuclear program, or seeing hypocrisy, and it's sort of fair to see this case in Central and Eastern Europe being kind of quickly shuffled into these transatlantic institutions or European institutions, but not anyone further along, and certainly not the Russians. That the bar was lowered so that the Poles could hop over it, but then raised up again, and the Russians weren't allowed in. This is generally the Russian attitude about these institutions. In the theoretical long term, where do Russians see themselves in their country? Well, if you pay attention to what Mr. Putin and Mr. Medvedev say, and I tend to believe that that's the best way to understand what they're thinking and what they want, the idea is for Russia to recognize its weaknesses and to turn them around. So there was an article famously written by Medvedev called Go Russia, and then there was a series of about 7 or 8 articles written by Putin in advance of the presidential campaign last year, in which he basically laid out what the problems were. He acknowledged in relatively straightforward terms what Russia's weaknesses were. He said, Russia is backwards. Russia does suffer from a kind of resource curse. Although he didn't use that term. He says, we're going to turn that around, and we're going to create an innovation economy in Russia. We're going to have 30 million innovation-oriented jobs by 2030. Impressive goal. We recognize the problem of corruption. We're going to turn that around. We're going to have more transparency in Russia in the future. We recognize the problem of paternalism, something that my colleagues at the Carnegie Moscow Center have actually dubbed a crisis of paternalism in Russia. Remember, I talked a little bit about how that perception can be overblown, but nonetheless, it is a problem. We're going to turn that around too, and Russia's going to have a vibrant civil society. Of course, how a state can mandate that there shall be a civil society is sort of beside the point in their thinking. In foreign policy terms, Russia is going to deepen its economic relations in the Far East, so not just China, and indeed they have attempted to begin that process. They're going to stop the drug flow from Afghanistan, and they're going to improve the image of Russia throughout Eurasia, throughout the world, and in particular protect what they consider the so-called Ruski Mir, the Russian world, the world of Russian speakers. In defense, Russia is going to invest $700 billion over 10 years for military modernization, and indeed that has begun. It's going to deploy 400 intercontinental ballistic missiles, 50 warships, 2,300 tanks, 100 military spacecraft, and 10 brigade kits of Iskander-M missile systems. So, some lofty and awfully specific goals. It's going to restore honor, prestige, and professionalism, and above all, pay to the military. Putin himself, although obviously an intelligence officer, not strictly speaking military, thinks of the military as having saved Russia. He's actually used those terms and said that the military was, in a sense, the moral backbone of the society, and he has restored honor and prestige to the Russian military and thereby turned the ship of state around. Now, I'm not sure that the ship of state hasn't turned a complete 360, but nonetheless, the military has played an important role in that. But not forgetting about the realm of social welfare, he also promises to train a so-called labor aristocracy, his term, 10 million skilled workers by 2020, to ensure that the salaries of professors, teachers, and doctors will be double the national average salary by 2020, and to provide support of various kinds for the poor, for veterans, for immigrants, and to encourage, this is the ancient Russian goal of settling the empty lands, to encourage settlement in less populated regions. That can be hard to persuade people to do when it is -20 outside. But regardless, these are some lofty and very specific goals for social welfare as well. Economically, I find this area very interesting because the reality is Russia's doing okay economically, but it is primarily trickle down from the sale of natural resources. So I think correctly, the Russian leadership has identified the areas in which they're falling short. They need more globally competitive research universities. The goal is to have them by 2018. But it's interesting today, if you compare Time magazine's top 200 global universities to Russia's own vision of the world's top universities, according to Time magazine, you get Moscow State University coming in at number 155 and St. Petersburg State at 168. According to Russia's own top 10 list, Moscow State is at number 5 in the world, beating Harvard, Stanford, and Cambridge universities in the ranking. So, I think the basic idea is there is an understanding of the nature of the problems and the weaknesses and the limitations, but it is constrained by the fact that, there's not a whole lot of realism, there's a lot of politics, and I think ultimately the means available to bring about these kind of dramatic changes are quite limited. One thing that the government can do is increase taxation, particularly on the wealthy and on luxury goods. The claim is that they can raise revenue in this way and pay for social services. It's interesting to me that the budget money, the state budget money, which mostly, again, comes from taxes on the companies producing natural resources, at this point is being increasingly diverted to pay for the military spending program. The most recent news was that there was going to be something like a 3% reduction in state budget spending on social welfare to pay for the increase in military spending. It's the only way, then, that you can pay for the social welfare is to increase taxes. Not a particularly populist move, I would imagine, and I wonder ultimately about the political wisdom of it for Mr. Putin. So, continuing on the theme of Russia's real reality here. Now, this is less about how Russia perceives itself and more about the reality in which Russia finds itself. The economy is, in fact, still growing. I would characterize this not as robust growth, as sort of tiger level of growth, but as real growth. It's at about 3 to 4% now versus up above 5% pretty consistently throughout the last decade. However, it is 80%, Russia's exports, which is a huge source of revenue, are 80% resource-based. Manufacturing is only 15% of its exports versus 90% for China. It's obviously an extreme example, but still 15% means they're not really making very much that the world wants to take. Of Russia's GDP, only 22% gets invested, in other words, put back into the economy. Most of it gets siphoned off somewhere to sort of what people consider to be safe investments, most famously to offshore holdings in Cyprus or real estate in the EU. Compare that, by the way, to 47% investment in China and about 33% in the United States. Russia comes in pathetically low in most of the World Bank rankings, 120 for ease of doing business, 111 for starting a business, 178, so basically within 10 of the bottom of the list for getting a construction permit, 98 for getting credit, 111 for protecting investors, 160 for trading across borders. Things like bribes, the expense of infrastructure, just working in a country that has poor infrastructure, security, and delays cost more than 12% of every item sold in Russia. So if you go to try and do business in Russia, you have to assume that your costs are going to be more than 10% higher than they ought to be just net in any other place. So fundamentally, right, this is a very tough place to do all the things that Putin and Medvedev are claiming that they're going to do. Create an innovation economy, create a Silicon Valley in Russia at Skolkovo, and start selling things that the world actually wants to buy. Russian budget is currently calibrated to break even at $115 per barrel for oil, and it will lose $3 billion if oil comes in at about $100 a barrel. So that pretty quickly can begin to eat up the country's stability fund, which, as I understand it today, is substantially below the most recent published figure. I find it somewhat striking that if you go to the Stability Fund's website on the Russian Finance Ministry's page, they say the Stability Fund is $157 billion, but the last update to the website was in 2008. So one wonders if there's really even anything left today. Fundamentally, this tension that I described earlier about, whether Russia subscribes to a Western model or some kind of exceptional Eurasianism or Asianism is a real hang-up for development, for mobilization of Russia's resources and for modernization of the economy. The problem, I think, that Putin faces right now is not that he's under real attack, that his system is about to come apart, that some forces from the outside, whether foreign or domestic, are going to bring him down. It's that he's so worried about these things that he's created a kind of self-isolation. And that means that officials around him, of course, are terrified to tell him the truth if they know it themselves. And he himself is heavily isolated from the reality of the society. And what that means is Russia doesn't even really know what people want. If you're going to retool a company, you need to know what the market demands. If you're going to retool an entire economy, you need to know what the world demands. And I think despite some of the lofty goals that I described earlier, I think a lot of this is just repetition of mantras. This is Dmitry Medvedev getting dispatched to Silicon Valley to say, we will have this, we will replicate this, but without any kind of real and deep and intuitive understanding on the part of the Russian leadership of what it was that brought that about in the first place, in this random place in California. So I think without that understanding, Russia is stuck more or less continuing in the path that it's been in. And what is that path? Well, it's not entirely without real resources. Its economic leverage is considerable. Obviously, oil and gas first and foremost. Obviously, that's also a double-edged sword, as we've seen in the various gas wars in Central and Eastern Europe. But minerals, raw materials, fresh water, land, in a world of global changing climates, these things could have a significant impact. If Lake Baikal has got 20% of the world's fresh water in it, who knows what that resource could be worth. But it is still fundamentally and overwhelmingly a market in both directions for post-Soviet economies. It is still part of the Soviet supply chain. It still depends on post-Soviet economies, and they still depend on it. That's not really a huge recipe for growth when you consider the direction that most of those states are going. Again, consider Belarus or Kyrgyzstan. Its military tools are arguably of some utility, but probably not as much as the Russians think. Its nuclear arsenal is increasingly central to its national security strategy, but it forces Russia into what I call the great power gambit, which is basically it's got to play its trump card in increasingly more situations internationally, which of course devalues the trump card and also makes it more and more likely that someone will call their bluff and say the emperor has no clothes. Russia has this deterrent, but it really has no ability to impact world affairs with its military might beyond that. This, of course, is the big reason why Putin is trying to build up their force projection capabilities, why, as you have most likely heard, they're doing an exercise in the Eastern Mediterranean now. I think the basic idea is Russia wants to return to some kind of status where it has the ability to do things other than by raising the nuclear trump card every time. I think there's still considerable intelligence assets and capabilities. The relationships and networks and the leverage that Russia can exercise shouldn't be overstated. I think we've seen that with Syria. We're long past the point with Syria, by the way, where if the Russians really had the ability to compel an outcome, they would have done it already. I think we're seeing the reality, which is that they can't. That doesn't mean that they don't have assets which could be very, very useful in managing the situation in Syria. If it is going to deteriorate further, there's going to be the likelihood of real chaos and violence ensuing as Assad actually goes down in flames. I think that, remember, we're talking about 30,000 Russian citizens on the ground. How many of those folks are controlling, let's say, networks of assets? I imagine that these are pretty significant capabilities, and they exist elsewhere throughout the world, including Central Asia. If you think about Afghanistan post-2014, that's probably a pretty useful set of tools for NATO and the United States to be engaged with. Politically, diplomatically, it goes without saying, UN Security Council veto, the fact that Russia does have this leverage of a kind with the former Soviet states, so it still is able to act as kind of a leader of a bloc diplomatically. It can not always, but sometimes bring other countries with it just simply by virtue of habit. And it has this sort of strange, probably also double edge from the perspective of trying to change perceptions of Russia, but it has this strange position as the de facto leader of the non-Western bloc. So when a country like Venezuela or Cuba or Syria or North Korea needs to turn to someone, and basically you don't even have to take real rogue states as examples, even just states that are sort of uncomfortable with Western hegemony, let's call it, Russia is the default option, and it has a number of things to offer. If you look at Russia's popularity, though, it's more or less on a decline globally. In Brazil, for example, in 2010, 38% approved of Russia. In 2012, it was 27%. In China, it's declined slightly from just above 50% to below 50%. In India, it's been pretty stable at 30%, but that's awfully low. Most of the Muslim world is now way under 25%, and I would posit that, if you took that survey in a week's time, in 2 weeks' time, it's basically hovering at zero, and that's obviously over Syria. The United States has gone from about 50%, believe it or not, in 2010. People were relatively high on Russia following the reset, now to 37%. I would posit that that, too, has plummeted dramatically. These numbers are before the most recent crisis over Magnitsky and adoptions. It's only in Ukraine and likely in Belarus and other post-Soviet countries that Russia remains at above 50% popularity. Which brings me to some of Russia's other tools. Of course, they have the Ruski Mir, the Russian-speaking world. That's a media and cultural sphere that does allow them to influence about 300 million people, plus or minus. They've got a cyber capability. Exactly how controlled by the Russian government it is not entirely clear. It is alleged that it was used in 2008 to great effect to basically take down the entire Georgian internet. And yet, at the same time, most of the capability probably resides with private hackers, people who have a kind of, sort of a privateer's deal going on with the Russian government, where they say, well, don't attack our stuff, attack anyone else that you want, but when we need you, we need to be able to rely on you. And of course, there's a vast web of Russian investments internationally, but as I noted earlier, most of that is capital flight, which means, it may be Russian in ownership, so it's Russian in name, but that doesn't mean that the Russian state has any ability to reach out and control those assets. All right, so let's come then to the U.S.-Russia relationship and how the United States ought to perceive and deal with the Russians. I think first and foremost, reality needs to be central. Russia is a big country that has lots of problems, and we shouldn't be naive about those problems or subscribe to, some kind of sort of dream vision of U.S.-Russia alliance and civilizational partnership and some of these things that I often hear Russians throwing out there. And yet at the same time, Russia is not an irrelevant basket case, the sort of mythology of the 1990s was that the Soviet Union used to be the world's other superpower, and in a few years it's going to be like a banana republic, right? Russia is neither nor, right? It's somewhere in between, and we've got to take it seriously. What the Russians call independent interests, whatever they may deem them to be, are going to be real. They're going to be factors that we have to take into account in our decision making because we don't have the ability to compel the Russians. We're still their partner of choice. That is a privileged position, right? The Russians would love to work with us first, mostly because it makes them feel big. When the United States is your partner, when the United States treats you as an equal, it is very good for you, even if you're Russia, even if you're bad-mouthing the United States all the time. So Russia's got to have a stake in whatever it is that we'd like to get done in order to want to work with us and in order to actually do so. Fortunately, we tend to agree with the Russians more often than we disagree. You know, Syria is an interesting case in this respect. All throughout this unfolding crisis, I've had the opportunity to talk to experts on Syria as well as to folks in the media who are reporting the very latest of, you know, he said, she said about Clinton and Lavrov and what the U.S. and Russian positions are. And every time I do, almost without exception, I find myself observing the same thing, which is we don't have a huge difference of interest on Syria. The biggest difference is simply that, you know, the Russians have wanted for a long time the United States to absolutely forswear intervention in the situation as a matter of principle, as a matter of their own interest, and as a matter of their desire to be the ones who are the author of the outcome. The United States has instead said, no, we're not exactly sure how we're going to deal with the situation, but we want you to support our resolution. You know, that's not a difference which is based on interest. That is a difference which is based on pride and style. And these are things that I think we can relatively easily get over if there's willpower. You know, we're in total agreement on issues of global proliferation, obviously on counterterrorism. You know, most strikingly, it was President Putin who was the first to call President Bush after September 11th and offer his condolences and his help. And it was not long after that that Putin said to the United States, you know, look guys, you're fighting the same enemy that we are. You know, look at what we're dealing with in the southern part of our country, in the North Caucasus and so on. Can't we be allies now? You know, he actually used the term ally and then indeed proceeded to assist the United States with Afghan northern distribution. So again, I'm not arguing that there should be some sort of, you know, fantasy of alliance, partnership, sort of civilizational friendship between Russia and the United States. But fundamentally, we're not on opposite sides of the barricades here on the things that matter most to us. I think the biggest problem we have, and the reason why probably every single person in this room would succeed if they sat down with a set of, you know, agreed goals to negotiate with a Russian counterpart, you'd probably get 90% of them, and the Russians would go home happy too. It's the political reality that we're dealing with in Washington today, and I'm sorry to be a representative of that in any sense. The political paradigm that has been reinforced even with this last election is that it's win or lose. You know, the other guy is the enemy, that you cannot happily come together after a lost election, deliberate about the best answers to our complex policy problems, hold hearings which are designed to be informative, which members of Congress actually attend, as opposed to simply convening. I don't know how many of you guys have seen the photo. Usually I bring a slideshow that has this picture of, you know, the completely empty congressional benches and, you know, the 20 or 30 witnesses and audience sitting in front of testifying to no one except to a video camera. You know, we don't have a deliberative process on Capitol Hill anymore. We don't have a mindset that enables people to see people who disagree with them as potential partners rather than as enemies to be vanquished. And I think the point here is not that people come to Congress with strong views about Russia and that they are not to be deterred or not to be dissuaded in those strong views. It's that they may not care about Russia at all, but not being practiced in Washington at doing this type of deliberative discourse and diplomacy and showing respect for the other guy, it makes it very hard for us in general in our foreign policy to deal with Russia and countries like Russia. Is that we're not practiced at dealing with people who are prickly, who have a strong idea of what their independent interests and what their independent course is. And that is particularly problematic for Russia. So what can we do to get this right? First, I would posit that we need a strategic framework for U.S.-Russia relations. As I said, Russia's not going away, and we have to take their interests into account. Russia has the capacity to be a key secondary player in first-order U.S. national interests: energy, security, free trade. Full stop. The tenor of U.S.-Russia relations trickles into other nuclear contexts, certainly, and other security contexts. Think of the Iran negotiations, think of events in Central Asia, think of Syria. When U.S.-Russia relations are not on a friendly footing, it makes every problem we deal with in the world more difficult. And our ability to secure cooperation from Russia ultimately depends on the institutional foundation for the relationship. This is something that I've written about probably more than anyone else in Washington. The idea that when the Russians say, we need to know whom to call, when, and about what, and we need to talk to you guys on a regular basis, we have to take that seriously. And we often don't. because it's not the top priority at the moment. The number of officials in the U.S. government who are dealing with the flaming crisis of Iran or the flaming crisis of Pakistan or Afghanistan or whatever it is at the moment absolutely dwarfs the number of people who have Russians in their Rolodex. You know, we've built a bilateral presidential commission, but the history of such institutions, that's headed by Obama and now by Putin on the Russian side, the history of such institutions in the U.S.-Russia relationship shows that each new administration tends to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Says, I can do it better than the last guy. I'm going to end this commission. So Bush ended Gore, Chernomyrdin. I fully expect the next president after Obama to end this bilateral commission. But of course, you've got to also have a substantive agenda. If I had to pick one, I'd start with Central Asia and Afghanistan after 2014. I would make an absolute goal to have real institutionalized cooperation between NATO and the Collective Security Treaty Organization. I would add to that list a new vision for Atlanticism and European security, the idea that we cannot forever get away with NATO being an exclusive club and European security being based on strategic stability, mutually assured destruction, and deterrence. We have got to have a vision of collective security which includes the Russians, a real inclusion of the Russians. The Russians have been asking for it. I think it's long past time we give it to them. I think we need to have a dialogue about East Asia which is focused on ensuring the stability of trade. That's something that we're both interested in. I hardly have to tell an audience here that, you know, free trade in East Asia depends on the United States Navy. We're not the only ones who ought to be bearing that burden forever. If a Northern Passage is real, if it's going to actually start hosting a significant amount of traffic, the Russians are going to have to play a very big role in that. So through a bilateral and multilateral East Asian dialogue, as well as through the Arctic Council, we've got to be talking about these issues early and often. And I would add that, and this may be more controversial, we need a modus vivendi on the post-Soviet space. The reality is Americans are going to have visions, are going to have interests for countries on Russia's periphery as well as for Russia itself. And we can talk at much greater length in Q&A about how to deal with the problem of sort of democracy and values and human rights vis-a-vis the Russians. But just vis-a-vis the post-Soviet space, where the Russians have said, this is our privileged sphere, this is our immediate neighborhood, these are our ethnic brothers, stay the heck out. I think we have to be willing to do a deal and simply say, look, what we want from this space is non-proliferation, stability, and trade access, and we're prepared to give the Russians, or to simply accept the fact that the Russians have got very significant political influence, cultural influence, and that these countries are going to be members in Russian-dominated institutions, however the Russians choose to shape these. Because I think fighting against it is likely to retard the development of these countries and to hurt the very values that we care about in the entire region much, much more than accepting the reality and being patient as these countries develop. So if there are three sort of principles that I can leave you with in terms of how to build the foundation for the relationship right, it would be first that, while the first term of the Obama administration was about kind of flashy resetting, changing the dynamic, building big new institutions, signing treaties, getting them ratified, presidential summits, and so on, I think the next 4 years needs to be about quiet competence. Just keep talking. Recalibrate your thinking if you can to try and show a little bit more respect, to try and bear in mind what Russia's interests are, but just keep building and building and building on the foundations that we've established. Second is that we need to invest in institutions and give them real, durable resources, right? So when we establish, for example, 3, I think even 4 now, working groups focused on security. We've got a nuclear security, we've got an intelligence sharing, we've got a counterterrorism, we've got a civilian defense policy, we've got a uniform defense policy, working groups with the Russians. These things have to actually meet. They actually have to have agendas. They have to have resources assigned to them so that when they come up with a good idea, let's do a joint exercise on submarine rescue in the North Atlantic so we don't have another Kursk disaster. It's got to be funded. Now, it was funded before, but what about the next big idea? Typically, it's impossible to get funding for these sort of things because they're not, like I said, the urgent wildfire of the moment. And then lastly, the rule of thumb, which is look inward before you point fingers. It's become very, very popular in the last year or so to find a reason why Russia is the problem. In fact, a lot of people have observed, and I think they're right, that we pointed at Russia first on the Syria issue before we even tried to get Russia's help in a meaningful way. We said Russia is the reason why Assad is not going. Well, that's patently absurd, right? Because the Russians reached a point where they too said Assad should go, and they couldn't make him go either. But the fact that we pointed fingers first puts us in a position now where we cannot as easily or as effectively engage the Russians to get the outcome that we want. So I think if we keep those principles in mind, keep a little bit of the context that I began with in mind, we may be in a better position, as I said, it's not going to be easy, it's not going to be quick, but over time I think ultimately we'll get to an acceptable place with the relationship. Thanks. And I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, Matt, why don't you just go ahead and just take questions directly?
Yeah. Great. So, questions, comments, arguments? Yes?
One thing you didn't mention, but I'm just curious, do you see any challenges with the Russian demographic changes, whether it's the decline of population or aging of population, that can impose either the Russians themselves or our relationship?
So statistically, and this comes from the Rosstat, which is the Russian Statistical Service, the decline actually turned around a couple of years ago. So that's the good news. The bad news is it's declined considerably since Soviet times. I think most of all what it means is Russia's going to have a harder time doing the same basic things that they know that they need to do. So for example, if you don't have a young enough labor force, you end up with an inverse pyramid for your social services. The fact that Putin is already redirecting spending away from today's social services is not doing the kind of reform that's necessary, for example, that we are trying to undertake now to get their healthcare system on track. They have a different problem. They have a single-payer health system. They have a national plan, et cetera, but they're not, for example, adopting electronic medical records at the pace that they ought to be doing. They're not looking at anything to deal with prescription drugs, which are not paid for, by the way. So you get prescribed a drug, most people can't afford it. So they don't use the drug, or they get a little bit of it and then they don't do the full course of treatment, which, as we know, creates resistant bacteria and so on. So, not making the investments today and then not having the wherewithal down the line because of the population decline is going to be problematic. The other thing I would look closely at is the regional distribution of demographics. So if you were to take Russia as Moscow, or Moscow and St. Petersburg and a few surrounding oblasts, actually they're doing great. They've grown by leaps and bounds. In fact, they're bigger now than they were in Soviet times, and they're rich. That's one Russia. And the rest of Russia is a different story, right? It's the ghost villages, it's the depopulated Far East and Siberia. I tend to think these things are not so much problems in and of themselves, but they're problems if you follow the Russian policy positions to their logical conclusion. So, for example, Putin wants Vladivostok to be kind of his gift to Russia, his San Francisco, his window on Asia, blah, blah, blah. That's not going to happen with the number of people living there, and you can't in the 21st century reality, you can't forcibly resettle people the way you could in Soviet times. Similarly, Siberia, traditionally, Novosibirsk was a big center, for example, of science and technology excellence, the idea being that you could sort of isolate these academics, they would really love it, you would give them all kinds of privileges, food, and nice dachas and things like that. That obviously doesn't work anymore, and yet the way that the Russian investments in higher education are structured today, they continue to treat universities throughout the country fundamentally equally, with the possible exception of Moscow State University, which is always privileged. So you're going to continue to invest in institutions that have fewer and fewer and fewer people who can take advantage of them. Obviously, you're wasting money. So I think the regional distribution of demographics is something that deserves a lot more attention, but it's shameful for Russia because they have to acknowledge that there are actually two Russias, or maybe two or three Russias. Okay, sure. Yes?
Thank you. Lieutenant Commander McElvain, Navy. Question for you. Do you think that pragmatic, mutually beneficial partnerships such as NASA and Roscosmos could be a model for mutual partnerships? And do you think Skolkovo is developing in such a way as to provide some of those technological partnerships?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be, I hope I haven't given anyone the impression of, being overly cynical here about Russia's real capabilities. Roscosmos is a great example, along with Rosatom and Rosnano, of places where, even though it's done in a top-down way, the Russians have put real resources into things, and they've developed capabilities that are appealing enough or reliable enough that the United States is prepared to say, yeah, we're going to put our shuttle program on hold, and we're going to rely on Russian launch capabilities. impressive, makes the Russians feel good, as long as it's, commercially sensible. I don't see why we wouldn't keep doing it. If you, think back to Apollo Soyuz and the International Space Station, these things have been, atmospherically, they have been very important. I don't know that I would call them foundations on the level of the stuff that I've been calling for. The stuff that I'm thinking about is exchanges, getting more Russians in the United States. The number of Russians in the United States in 2001 was 52,000. In 2010, it was, 2011, it was close to 200,000. So that's a 4x increase, really positive. The number of Germans, a comparably sized country population-wise in the United States, was over 2 million in the same year. The number of Brazilians, right, comparably sized economy, was over 1.5 million, right? So, the potential is there. There's no reason why Russians shouldn't be coming in those numbers, other than the fact that until recently you had to give a blood sample to get a visa to come to the United States from Russia. And it's totally done by tit for tat. Now we have a new visa agreement. Will it be implemented? I intend to submit for a visa under that agreement shortly and find out. I don't know. There tends to be a big gap between, the law and the reality in this relationship. Skolkovo is another case where the Russians have, by fiat, said this field shall become Silicon Valley. But they have also said, we are prepared to create an exceptional regulatory environment here where you will have real access to courts to protect your property, that the police will not be corrupt, you name your problem with business. The 12% that I mentioned before, the things that cost you money, those things won't apply in Skolkovo. Now, obviously, some of them still will, but the Russian government does have the ability to use it as an incubator. And as long as they understand it as an incubator and not as, yet another Russia, a fourth Russia that they're going to create next to Moscow, which is a real danger, right? For much of Russian history, you had sort of the elite of Russia living in a total fantasy land, which was basically, sort of Parisian salons, and then, the rest of Russia was wrapping cloth and paper around their feet to survive the winter. It's entirely possible that Skolkovo will be one of those fantasies, or it's possible that Skolkovo will be nothing. Again, I don't mean to be too cynical here, but money tends to disappear very, very quickly, even when it's been assigned for one of these priority national tasks. And the fact that Dmitry Medvedev, who was sort of the author, or at least the lead sponsor of Skolkovo, has been, pretty quickly sidelined out of Russian politics almost completely, is used as a kind of, a sort of scapegoat and just a sideshow by Putin, doesn't bode well for a project like that. Putin, I think, fundamentally does not see the relationship with the United States as a top priority. It's something that Medvedev got done and that he supported as long as it was producing real results. But like I said, Putin saved Russia through a strong military. Putin is looking at the East. That's an area, by the way, where we can offer them some value, right? Because they've got these independent interests. We got interests there too. And they're